Hey everybody, welcome to the Cannabis track of Boulder Startup Week. We are really excited we're doing this in conjunction with the medical track. So we are talking a little bit about kind of cannabinoids and what is the medical reality of cannabinoids. For those of you who don't know what cannabinoids are, we're talking about CBD, THC, and lots of other cannabinoids that you may be less familiar with. We are so lucky today to have two really pretty much experts on this with us. So Dr. Helena Yardley, who has a dual PhD in neuroscience and physiology, and is the CEO of 6 Degrees Wellness, as well as Tristan Watkins, Dr. Tristan Watkins as well, who also has a PhD in neuroscience and is the Chief Science Officer of Lucid Mood, which is a cannabis brand. So thank you guys both so much for joining us and for sort of diving into this topic. We're excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Cool. So I think just to sort of kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with cannabinoids, your research around cannabinoids, and kind of how long you've been thinking about and sort of working with this topic?
Sure. You want to start, Helena?
Helena, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I entered into the industry about 2012, actually, as a consultant, and started with actually a CBD company who's interested in putting together more information for their physicians to understand what research is out there. And at the time, I really, I thought medical marijuana, sure, I wasn't really a user myself and didn't really know what data was available out there. And once I started consulting, I realized there's an enormous amount of really great data and so much more ground to cover, and got really into it. And so, fast forward a few years, I've worked within the licensed marijuana industry, as well as for a few other CBD companies. And then also, in the last couple of years, decided to launch into my own CBD company. And so I've been involved in clinical research and product development and everything soup to nuts. So excited to talk to you a little bit about the research aspect and, why it's been so difficult and where do we go from here and what do we know?
Cool. How about you, Tristan?
Sweet, yeah. So I kind of started in my own little research project back when I was still in Nashville at Vandy doing, in my academia world. Around, a few years before that, I had kind of heard of all this medical cannabis, all these potential benefits that medical cannabis might have. And it didn't really make sense that cannabis could do this, 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 and this, but also curiously do all the exact opposite things too. So seeing this sort of like wealth of potential effects that were sort of afforded from the cannabis plant got me really interested in just sort of researching what's actually in it. THC isn't some super molecule. So what else is there to the cannabis plant and what's there to learn? That of course just sort of opened this world, this almost Pandora's box of everything that cannabis naturally expresses. And it essentially led me to leave academia, move out to Colorado about 5 years ago or so, and essentially start working with Lucid Mood, where we sort of break down the cannabis plant and start pulling out the active ingredients that are naturally expressed and then reforming them into very specific formulations in order to deliver differentiated effects. So from there, we're
awesome.
Cannabinoids and all sorts of things.
So I think a good place maybe to start here, I don't want to assume knowledge of our listeners, but can we talk about cannabinoids? What is a cannabinoid? What makes something cannabinoid? What are the ones that we know? And maybe what are the ones that people are less familiar with?
Sure, it's funny because we obviously have such overlapping knowledge right now. So I'll do endo, you exo, I guess. So one thing that I think a lot of people don't really recognize, because THC and CBD are so popular right now, is that your body itself already naturally creates cannabinoids themselves. They're just called endocannabinoids, which means they are created endogenously or within your own body. And I'd say the most familiar sort of cannabinoid feeling, or just cannabinoid in general, that people would have experienced is sort of a runner's high. So you have anandamide, which is basically released during high bouts of of activity and a variety of other sort of activities themselves, but that runner's high that everyone talks about is in fact sort of that first cannabinoid high that people really experienced before they found cannabis itself.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then, you know, fast forward to, so those are endocannabinoids, right? And then exocannabinoids are really just cannabinoids that are derived from somewhere else, like the cannabis plant. And so, you know, that's why there's such a, we're so, I guess, adept at using this plant. Our physiology is adept at using this plant because we already have something similar within ourselves. And so cannabinoids, you know, we're most familiar with THC and CBD, but there are a number of other cannabinoids and other terpenes and other flavonoids that are part of the cannabis plant. And what we're finding out is that a lot of these different compounds have differential actions within the body. So in a lot of cases, CBD and THC kind of have opposite effects. There are some similarities, but you know, one thing when somebody says cannabis and cannabis has this effect, it drives me crazy because there's so many different components. So whenever somebody says cannabis, I always want to say which part, because it's really important. And one thing in the research right now is that oftentimes the research was just on cannabis. And so it's not a very high resolution look at what exactly is going on with that particular cultivar, you know, what were the different components of that cannabis plant, you know, what were the conditions under which it was used. And so I think now we're starting to get a little bit better detail as far as what are these different components and how do they interact with our bodies.
And even to elaborate on that complexity a little bit, not only do you have all these compounds that are naturally expressed in cannabis that completely confuses how you actually study an individual variable, but there's also this misconception that they all act directly on the endocannabinoid system as well. A lot of these compounds act completely independent of the endocannabinoid system, but because the system is so widespread and touches such a variety of other primary systems, you still get this sort of effect. So people aren't wrong that the endocannabinoid system is in some way implicated, but you know, CBD alone is a great example where you know, some of its strongest action is actually in the serotonin system instead of the endocannabinoid system. But we still call it a cannabinoid, sometimes, you know, as a function of discovering it in the cannabis plant and recognizing that it does have some binding ability or affinity to those endocannabinoid receptors within the system itself. A lot of confusion.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, it's obviously such a large area. This is such a large topic. Specifically, I think today we're going to talk a little bit about what's available for users right now, and sort of what's the hype, right? This is the cannabis and hemp track that we're talking about this on. So, can you guys talk to me a little bit about what are the cannabinoids that are out there right now for consumption in this sort of industry, and how are those sort of showing up in the market?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have, you know, you should take this on because I have, I kind of approach things from what do we know from the research, and there's a lot of cannabinoids that are being isolated and becoming more commercially available. So, you know, THC and CBD, obviously the two most popular ones, but CBG has been making more of an appearance. And so for me, I kind of look at what do we know in the literature and then, you know, focus on that as far as consumption. But, you know, CBC is another one. Tristan, do you want to expand on that?
So I would initially just sort of reflect exactly what you said. That's kind of where we are too. We're primarily looking at THC and CBD, although most you can find them in their purest form most easily and in a most cost-effective manner. Then we branch out the CBG. CBN is another one that's very interesting. You know, there's a whole lot of anecdotal evidence, or let's say reports, that's the most credit I'll give it, that it helps with insomnia. That being said, the literature doesn't have a lot to necessarily support that, not at least from a clear story. But at the end of the day, you know, you kind of have to look at research and then more marketing and consumer behaviors. So I expect we'll start seeing CBN in a lot more products as it becomes more accessible, simply because of this sort of anecdotal known effect that it may have, whether or not that is a consistent effect that applies to all individuals that consume it. THCV is another kind of popular one. Speaking of anecdotal reports, it's supposed to help with hunger. I think that stems from a couple of metabolic syndrome studies, or I guess it was type 2 diabetes studies that they're looking at. You know, you can basically take any cannabinoid and put an A on it or a V on it, and that's another rare cannabinoid that people are searching for. So, I mean, a lot of little kind of subcategories within these more primary ones that we've discussed.
Yeah.
So
with CBG, so as far as the literature out there, probably, you know, the most on CBD, and then CBG, it seems like there's a lot of research coming out about just more neuroprotective effects, but we also know that about the other cannabinoids too. So it'll be interesting, you know, as this becomes more commercially available and people are consuming it more, there's an opportunity to collect more data. So it'll be interesting to see how those shake out, you know, especially with CBN.
Yeah.
That brings up an interesting sort of point around anecdotal evidence versus actual research. What has the path been? I'm sure it differs depending on kind of what we're talking about, but you know, I think it's everywhere, right? Where we hear about CBD and it can do this and it can do that, and I think that the concern around the FDA, right, is are people replacing medication and other therapies with these cannabinoids, or that they don't really know, we don't really understand kind of how they work in the body completely. So can you speak a little bit, I mean, where are we in terms of research? Like, are we relying on anecdotal evidence? Is there any kind of hard science that tells us what this does?
Sure. There's a variety of different levels of research that have occurred on these cannabinoids. You have everything from pure anecdotal, you know, 10 people sat in a room, got high and felt this way and claimed it did this, all the way to an FDA-approved Epidiolex, which is a CBD isolated tincture, essentially. And beyond that, you have Sativex, same company in GW Pharmaceuticals that created both of these products. But, you know, obviously because the US still has THC as a Schedule 1, there are a variety of other countries that have allowed Sativex, which is a 1-to-1 THC to CBD product, approved for moderate pain relief, has actually gone through other countries' FDA equivalent sort of regulatory bodies as well. So we have very serious research, and then everything down to more market level research, which I would put about where Lucid Mood is. You know, I apply real scientific practices. I actually try to use how I would typically do research, but I'm building it for a product that should be monetized. So it's sort of this proof of concept level of research, all the way down to, listen, I read a bunch of Leafly articles. They say this does this, so my product clearly does this, which I don't know if you're talking about research, but it's something.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's really important too. So, you know, looking at people in a room and getting data from them, it really depends on how that data is collected. So like taking a more scientific approach to, you know, is there any kind of bias in the way I'm asking this question? Are there any, you know, what are the confounding variables so that we can try and tease out of this? And so I think that process is really valuable. And so so to answer your question, Celia, there's a lot of data that's out there on those different levels, but part of the issue is that, you know, it's been a Schedule 1 drug and it's very difficult to study within an academic setting. So, you know, there's a handful of researchers that have done a really good job at, you know, being creative. So looking at what's the framework in which I need to do this research, and then how can we push that boundary a little bit? So for instance, like the Cannabis at CU, it was a really great idea where they couldn't do the research on campus, so why not bring the research facility to the people? You know, same thing with Ryan Bandry out on the East Coast. You know, they wanted to look at edibles, and so they're actually able to make hot brownies within their laboratory and study those, which was, you know, really, really great. But, you know, there's also different levels. So like a lot of the research that I've done is observational studies. So being able to track down a particular group of people who are using one product or one compound or what have you, and then start to collect data on those people. And so a lot of the research recently has been that. as you said, Tristan, it's, other countries have done a lot better at allowing that research to be done. And so unfortunately, the US is way behind as far as really quality research. But I think given the descheduling, at least of, CBD, that there might open up an opportunity. But honestly, in the last year, my experience talking with universities is it's really, they're still not convinced that it's not going to become a problem to have that on campus and study that on campus. Yep. And so it really depends on the university and the risk tolerance and, trying to find creative ways to work together so you can do that research, but it's been just very difficult.
Academics aren't exactly known for being risk takers, and studying cannabis is a sufficient risk to their career for sure. You have to remain, for the most part, self-funded. So spending time writing a grant on something that's unlikely to be funded and unlikely to be supported by your own administration it's a waste of time, unfortunately, if you wanted to continue to succeed in academia. Obviously, there are some people that have taken this risk, but overall, it's a bit of an uphill battle, to say the least. So.
Yeah, and apart from the time commitment too, it's the possibility of having the institutions federal funding stripped from them, which is why a lot of universities are just like, you know what, we support it, we want to know more about it, but we just can't adopt that risk and lose, $400 million of federal funding. Yeah. One study. And so until there's like a clear, just, hey, this is okay to have and study, I think it's going to continue to be difficult.
But I mean, I understand that's definitely an issue, I think, here in the US and around the world. I mean, it sounds like there's countries that are not the United States that are doing a lot of research. I was in Tel Aviv last year for a cannabis conference, and Israel seems to really be leading the way. How much of that research is being sort of brought into market, products that are on the market in the U.S. and, that kind of thing?
Are you referencing Canatech, by the way?
I am.
Yeah, great conference.
Yeah, it was fun.
So I don't know, from my perspective, I love what Israel is doing, but they're very much a medicinal forward country in how they're doing this. Mm-hmm. So I'm not seeing a lot of reports around, based recreationally driven effects. That being said, you've seen amazing work coming out of like Dee Mary's lab, specifically looking at cancer research. I just can't speak much to that crossover because of where we are grounded as a company. So we actually actively
right.
from the medicinal side because, well, I'm not interested in overstepping what we actually are. So.
Right, sure. And I think, you guys obviously approach this a little bit differently. Tristan, your product is very much a recreational product. Helena, your product, I think, is a little less on the recreational side. Maybe you guys could speak to that a little bit. Why those avenues are appealing, and maybe what are some of the sort of challenges within those different avenues?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting for me, like looking at what literature is out there, and there's so many amazing nuggets that, companies could use to, build out their product portfolio, or just, do something that might increase bioavailability. By the way, there's a lot of information out there and a lot of marketing that says, increase bioavailability because they used a particular method that might, create a nanoparticle. And it drives me crazy because there's no regulation around that. And, you need to have the right analytical equipment to verify, hey, is this actually what it is, or does it just reconstitute itself back to its original size?
Mm-hmm.
And, on top of that, there's
put in the right medium anyways for that. Yeah. For the original effort to matter. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
You're diving into something that's giving me a lot of heartburn.
Unless you actually test it in a person or an animal, if that's, within your realm of comfort, you don't really know whether it actually does increase bioavailability or not. So that's one thing I'd like to see a lot more of, because that research is actually pretty easy to do. Mm-hmm. It takes some capital to do it.
Yeah, capital and some simple PK studies.
Yeah.
Not that challenging. Yeah, even on that point, it's interesting because there are. So I don't want to say I did say that we didn't look to like what Israel's publishing, but as you've mentioned, there are a number of peer-reviewed published papers out there. We've kind of gone down this sublingual, buccal, whatever oral administration route. Found some interesting nuggets. There's things that have been sitting out there for 40 years. Papers that are 40 years old, and I can't believe some of these edible companies aren't touching them, but then I can because I know how cannabis companies work. But then, from our perspective, it's beyond just cannabinoids. There's a lot of research, again, not in the US because of like funding practices work, but specifically in like Japan and Brazil, there's been a lot of funding on aromatherapy, which breaks down into compositional analyses of essential oils that leads to like things like terpenes and flavonols, and what are some of the benefits that these types of compounds may have. And of course, these compounds are unlikely to have an equivalent benefit of, let's say, a pharmaceutical, but they also probably come with significantly less risk depending on what you're trying to use them for. So sort of in our minds, if we wanted, we no longer even have this product out, but we had a product that was designed specifically to help with anxiety. I can say anxiety because we don't even have this product out, so can't say anything to us. But that was the point of it. And the goal was not to create a Xanax, Valium, whatever benzo replacement, because if you have a severe anxiety disorder, this isn't going to touch it. And there's a reason why some of these pharmaceuticals have been made. But there are a number of people that would probably benefit from switching from a much stronger prescription level medication to help with some very low-lying underlying anxiety issues. And that's kind of where we wanted to sit for a little bit, was how can we provide the best that cannabis can offer while not promising that it's any more than what cannabis reasonably should be allowed, should actually can offer, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, because it for a while, it feels like, it's been around forever, but I think physicians are just now starting to get comfortable with, learning more and adopting that within their practice and being able to use that as a tool in their practice to see if that helps, which is great because there's so many different things, we don't know. When you're dealing with pharmaceuticals, it's a really intense thing for the body, generally speaking. And so when you remove that suddenly, what's going to happen as far as like, if we're talking about depression or anxiety or whatever, what happens with your, neural chemistry. And so I think it's great to see how many physicians are starting to really like jump on the bandwagon so that they can kind of track those things and be the go-to, because like as a brand, you want to be able to reach people who are going to benefit from your products. And so to be able to have a knowledgeable middle person that can help, look at all the other factors and just handle patient safety is really great. So I think that's been a trend I've seen really pick up some speed in the last year, is just more physicians that want to know more, they want more education. So.
Exactly. I think that's, especially anxiety and depression are two big ones. The idea of someone taking their pharmaceutical benzo every single day and then cutting cold turkey is completely unsafe to do. And if the physician isn't open to having that conversation, then their patient might just do it without them. So it is nice to see physicians be more interested. And then you have individuals that are on SSRIs, which strongly impact the serotonin system, that are now also taking CBD on top of it, which also impacts the serotonin system without discussing this with their physician. So, these are things where, these physicians don't necessarily need to go in and say, go smoke weed, it'll fix your problems. But it would be nice if they had enough research available to them to where they can at least have these more open discussions with their patients at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you guys bring up an interesting point about kind of claims and where this sort of fits in the market, right? So I think that, for those people who are listening who maybe aren't as aware, we did legalize hemp last year, or I'm sorry, in 2018, the end of 2018. And that's been great, except that we still don't have rules from the FDA around sort of how we can talk about CBD particularly, right? And so I think that there's a lot of unknown about sort of what we can say, and maybe Helena can speak to this a little bit too, but around how do we talk about this? What are the claims? Is CBD and cannabinoids being treated more as a pharmaceutical, or is it treated more as a nutrient, right, and sort of a supplement, or is it something totally different? Is it more of like a recreational product that doesn't really fit into any of those categories?
Yeah, it's a little tricky because when you're talking about marketing and what you can say in marketing, it's just completely kind of unrelated. So there's only two ways you can go, which is kind of the supplement pathway where you can support this, support mental health, or, support post-exercise recovery and things like that. But, when it comes to making a claim about a disease, like this will treat anxiety, the FDA requires a full, set of clinical trials in order to make that claim, which is possible, but, it's very time and resource intensive. And so, there's a little bit, and really that pathway is there just to protect people, right? Because as like you mentioned, Trista, there's a lot of different levels of studies that you can do, and each one of those come with a different level rigor and trustworthiness as far as the results. And so you want to make sure that, whatever study you're running, you limited all the other possible factors that are leading to your outcomes. But, when they look at a patient population, like I said, there's a lot of these observational studies. So they look at a clinical condition, people prior to using cannabis, and then after using cannabis, and then reassess these different symptoms. And, you see that people have benefited from that, but you can't really use that as like, this treats that, because it just wasn't a rigorous enough study in order to make that claim per the FDA standards. But I think that's why, there probably has been such a strong community built around cannabis and CBD, because people are becoming their own citizen scientists and, trying to track their own symptoms and say, hey, this really worked for me, and they want to share that with their community. So, I think amongst users, they can talk about that, but obviously as a company, you don't want to make those claims unless you've done that kind of rigorous research. But, it puts you in a bind when you hear just overwhelming evidence from people that say, hey, this really helped, my XYZ. You want to be able to share that with other people, but that's just not the way that marketing and the FDA works within the US.
Yeah, I totally hear you. That's interesting. So switching gears a little, I think something that I'm curious about, you guys clearly study this, and you live in America, so you've heard a lot about what's happening and sort of the hype around hemp and CBD and cannabinoids. What's your favorite myth? Can we bust some myths? Anything that you've heard out there that you're like, that's not true, or we don't know that that's true, you shouldn't be talking about that? Can we bust some?
Sure.
Oh my God. This could be its own entire discussion. So my favorite one is that you need THC to activate CBD. The sentence doesn't even make sense. It's THC, right? THC isn't some like catalyst. I don't understand what that sentence even means necessarily, outside of the fact that like, it's absolutely ridiculous, right? So if CBD is supposed to help with anxiety, or supposed to be anti-inflammatory, it's supposed to help with seizures. The last one is the only one that you can actually really say, because it's the only one the FDA has approved. But other than that, or not even seizures, just Tourette's specifically. But like, if it's supposed to do this, why would taking THC be a requirement with this as well? It's its own active individual compound. It's the way it's the way Western medicine has been forever, basically, is that one single compound does a single thing. Why would it ever need to be combinatory? That one makes no sense to me. I don't understand where it started.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And another thing is, people always say, was this derived from marijuana or was this derived from hemp as far as CBD? Because You know, there's a common myth that drives me crazy that CBD from marijuana is more potent than CBD from.
I love that one.
Absolutely not true. It's just, you're just looking at the molecule, and the molecule, whether it came from hemp or whether it came from marijuana, is just the molecule. So
Which, by the way, those are the same plant.
Yeah, I know. There's that too. Added one new definition to them, but they're the same plant. Yeah, that one. There's also this idea that CBD isn't fun and that it has no place in the THC world either. So the flip side, where like, you know, heavy users don't want any CBD in their product because they think it undoes their high, mitigates the high or something like that, which is kind of absurd because the other argument these same people love to push is that the entourage effect is like the most important thing that cannabis has to offer. While they take a lot of care to remove one of the clearest aspects of the entourage effect, which is the two most prominent cannabinoids expressed in cannabis. So that's another one that I find a little bit odd. And I think, you know, all three of these really highlight the lack of clear messaging within the industry, and how just an anecdotal report or someone with a platform, regardless of how much expertise they actually have, like can push this message out so strongly to an industry, and it just gets eaten up because nobody knows any better really. So if your like favorite blogger who is the expert to you says something that's wrong, why would you have any reason to not believe them? So
yeah. And I think you know, a lot of people, I've heard that like CBD by itself is just not effective, and especially when it comes to formulation development, sometimes there's like, you know, we added all these different things in and therefore it's more effective. But most of the clinical research that's out there is just run-of-the-mill CBD, isolated from, you know, and so I think that people forget that a lot of the research that is out there is really just CBD, you know, and I speak more so from the CBD side because, you know, it's the industry I'm in right now, but, you know, especially when you're really limited with what you can study. So I'll back up and say, you can study cannabis on campuses, but it needs to be derived from a certain source, which is NIDA. And so NIDA has certain offerings. They've gotten better over the years about what they have to offer as far as the like potency and being able to isolate CBD and THC. But, you know, there's still a little bit limited in what they can offer. And so a lot of that research is just based off of run-of-the-mill CBD isolated from government marijuana.
Got it. That brings up an interesting point about the sort of quality of products, right? So I think obviously I work on the very much the market side, right? And sort of what is happening and how consumers are interacting with these products. I think one of the most shocking things is that consumers really don't understand these products. They don't understand what makes a good product or a bad product, what they should be looking for. What are some, so maybe you guys can tell me, and Helena, I know that you work specifically on this, like what are some of the things that as a consumer I can be asking about my product to understand its efficacy or whether or not it's kind of right for me?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different questions that are probably just unanswered within that. But as far as quality, that's something that has driven me crazy for a long time. So back in 2017, a group of researchers had pulled a bunch of products, and this is just on the CBD side, pulled a bunch of products, tested them to see how closely what's on the label matches what's actually in the bottle, and found that around 70% of those were mislabeled. So fast forward to, you know, obviously a big problem with quality in the industry, right? So fast forward to just, I think, January of this year, we internally decided to do our own analysis. So found a CBD retailer that had all their certificates of analysis available because they only carry products that are third-party tested, which I'm in full support of because I think that testing and transparency of testing is important. But then what we found across that analysis was that almost 50% of those were invalid. So the certificates of analysis didn't match the product, or it was testing the bulk isolate that they use to manufacture the final product, or they submitted the same certificate of analysis for multiple products. And so there's a lot of kind of subtle deception within that particular group of like third-party tested. So then you just look at the certificates of analysis that were deemed valid. And within those, I think it was like less than 25% actually were within 10% of the label claim, which is incredible. And so when we look at one side of the spectrum or the other, it was like one on the highest end, one product had like 400% more in the bottle than what it had on the label, which has a lot of different implications. You know, you actually can overdose on CBD. That is a possibility. So if you're somebody who's taking a high dose, like say you're taking 1,000 milligrams a day and you use that product, you could actually be taking 4,000 milligrams a day, which could actually be very harmful. On the flip side of that, you know, some of those had 0 CBD in them, and it was just like, how can you market that? Even within like third-party tested categories. So as far as consumers and what questions they can ask, I think, you know, looking for that certificate analysis, but also taking it upon themselves to learn how to interpret those. Because even for us, when we were trying to interpret what's in the final product, it was really tricky because they don't always report all the information that you need to get that final potency. They're just, you know, asking questions, seeking help, trying to really understand the math of like, what does this say on this test?
It brings up an interesting point about dosing in general. You know, where do we even start, right? Like, how do we even think about dosing, and what is maybe an appropriate amount?
Yeah.
Do you remember the numbers that came from that one clinical study? Like, was it 18 months ago? They tried to give a clinical dose of CBD. Wasn't it? It was like.
Which one?
I can't remember. It was like 18 months ago, and someone actually tried to give a starting clinical dose, or at least a perceivable clinical dose of CBD, but I've since forgotten the actual megs per kilo.
Yeah.
Number for it. I didn't know if you remembered it off the top.
No, you know, it really depends on what condition you're looking at, right? Yeah. So like with Epidiolex, yeah. So like for Epidiolex, it's anywhere from 5 to 20 milligrams per kilogram.
Okay.
So that's quite a bit. You know, as far as a daily dose. Now that's definitely on the higher side. When you're looking at things like the literature around sleep and anxiety, the doses are actually way lower. Mm-hmm. I think the lowest I saw was around 20 milligrams, but most of the research is usually around like 300 milligrams per day. Yeah. And it's not necessarily because that's the therapeutic dose. It's just the dose that the researchers were like, I think we'll find something here. Let's do this dose.
You know, for your pilot study, right? So yeah. Just start strong, right?
Yeah, because you don't want to run the study and then not get any results because it's expensive. It's, you know, time intensive. So as far as dosing, like what we always encourage people to do, we have a little daily wellness log so that people can start with a dose, stick with it for a week, and then track how they're feeling on a daily basis. Because what people do is that they start, you know, at this dose, and then they start at this dose, and then they forget how they felt. And sometimes it takes, you know, a week or 2 weeks or more to really settle into, is this the right dose for me? And
so if you're looking for like anti-inflammation or something, that's not an immediate reaction anyway. So you have to think of it on a longer time scale. So.
Right. So yeah, we just always suggest people write it down and track it. And, you know, one of the things I love doing is just being able to write blog posts, and Johnny as well, on like what research has come out recently to try and help, you know, just educate people so that they can make their own decisions about, you know, where they want to start.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Nothing else to add. I specifically would have recommended the journal thing, honestly. That's the only real way to do it. It's so variable with everybody. So. Plus, you know, we're finding out that some people are ECS deficient too. So, right, if you naturally just have a lower baseline of endocannabinoids, then your dose will likely be different than if you're at a more TD like level or something along those lines. So
Yeah.
with THC, always start low.
Yeah.
You much rather
that we know.
yeah.
Cool. Well, we're kind of getting towards the end here, but my sort of last question for you guys is a bit about the future of cannabinoids as a medical product. I think we talked a little bit about research and kind of what needs to be done, but what are you guys seeing in terms of what the future looks like for this segment?
So rather than just on the research, I'm envisioning and honestly hoping, like fingers crossed, that we have two different pathways when it comes to cannabinoids in the market. That pharma won't finally realize how much money they can make, and then all of a sudden it gets wiped out from the recreational side and is controlled by pharmaceutical companies. So what I'm imagining is, Epidiolex is kind of stage one, where pharma starts carving out what it owns. And that has already a bit of a ripple effect. You're starting to see, CBD can't be added to foods because of the way the Farm Bill is written, because you can't add something to food if it has a known medicinal value to it. And now because Epidiolex has been approved by the FDA, the FDCA is now all up in arms. And you're seeing California and New York specifically actually taking action against some ingestible CBD products. So, that type of thing starts worrying me in the sense that pharma might be able to reach its hands into everything cannabis. So hopefully two avenues persist, where we're going to stick with, you can't make any claims, but it's recreational, versus this is pharmaceutical and there are serious medicinal values to it. I won't speak to research because I imagine Helena has more to say about it than I do. So.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think, on the flip side of that, the FDA is really they're just interested in safety, right? So they just want to make sure nobody gets hurt. And I think that with so much widespread label inaccuracy, and we're just kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with not being able to provide a product that's just consistent, just from a potency standpoint. So I personally, I'm kind of excited about FDA regulation coming down the pipeline, and hopefully that does happen this year, because I think that will, one, help bolster the industry so that there's a guideline of this is what you can do and this is what you should be doing. And it also opens up more opportunities for big box retailers and physician healthcare practitioners to adopt that more widely, because it's less risky, because there'll be more regulation to ensure that it's safe. Mm-hmm. So I think that, I don't know, because everything moves very slowly with FDA, but maybe something will come down the pipeline this year, which I think will be good. I think it would be hard to push out all of the artisanal, CBD products, and licensed marijuana kind of sits in its own category, and it seems like FDA doesn't really oversee marijuana as much as the CBD companies.
Yeah, they sort of let states do their thing with their own regulations.
Yeah, and so that's what I think is coming down the pipeline. And then as far as research, I think that more will get going here soon. Like I said, I think people are becoming, it just takes that one person to really go on a limb and just be let's see what happens, and do the research. And then, it's well received and there's very little risk associated with it. And then other people jump on the bandwagon. But I think probably a lot more safety studies. So, I've worked with a number of different CBD companies, and a number of them are doing safety studies, which I think is really, really great, because that kind of information is really valuable to regulatory groups. So that way you can just say, hey, we did this over a course of 6 weeks, and this is what the results were. So probably more safety information, more drug interaction studies will hopefully be done. But we'll see. It's a constantly moving target, and it's always changing. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting industry to be a part of, right? Because it's different all the time. It changes in dog years, right? So it's a year. So much can happen in a year. So much can happen in a month in this industry. So for all the entrepreneurs out there who are sort of interested in this space. I think from my side, what I've seen is that the people who are able to sort of stay on top of it are the ones who can participate and do a good job. So yeah, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been such a great conversation. If people want to sort of learn more about you guys or more about your products, can you tell us kind of where to direct them?
Yeah, sure. You can always feel free to reach out to me personally. It's Helena at 6degreeswellness.com, SIX. And then, we have our blog, and we actually have a podcast called the CBD Deep Dive that is usually highlighting some sort of recent research that, gets our gears turning and we think is exciting. So I'd say, check out the blog, check out the podcast, reach out if you have questions. We love to talk about information about CBD, especially recent research.
Cool.
Yeah, and if you want to get in contact with me, my email is tw@lucidmood.net. The website is lucidmood.net as well. We have a blog on there as well that I've written most of the pieces for. Much more recreationally driven though.
Sure.
You wouldn't get a lot of overlap between mine and Helena's blogs. But yeah, and then we have an Instagram. I'm really bad at the whole plugging thing, but we have an Instagram and all sorts of things. Google's your friend. Type in Lucid Mood.
And you can get Lucid Mood at a lot of dispensaries in Boulder. So if you're watching this, you can go check out their products too. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time and giving us some info. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Elaine.
Cool. We'll stay healthy and sane and safe.
You too. Same to the viewers.